Okay, I'll be talking about research that I've done with Phila Bayan and Jiachen Hao, and I'll allude to their work there. I'll start by talking about the classical approach to writing research, cognitive research, and then indicate ways in which I think it's problematic, and ways in which the dual process model, which I'll talk about, differs from that. Then I'll give you some empirical research illustrating that, and then I'll introduce some new data about, based on a questionnaire study, looking at people's writing beliefs and how that relates to the quality of the eventual text. They'll all be mostly undergraduates, the writers. I think probably all, I'm not sure. Okay, this thing. Okay, so this is Hayes and, wow, it's quite small, isn't it? This is Hayes and Flowers, a classic model of the writing process, which is essentially just descriptive. It's funny, it hits the back, because you're not getting red dots on your screen, right? Okay, I'll point. That essentially says you have writer's long-term memory with various things in it, which feeds content, you retrieve content from that as part of the planning process, where you can organize ideas, and you do that in response of goals, and that's cued by the writing assignment. Those feed into translating it into text, which produces the text produced so far, which you can then review and edit, and that's controlled by an overall monitor. So it's not very complicated, it just describes the basic elements of the process. The main important distinction associated with this was Bareiter and Scardameli's contrast between knowledge telling and knowledge transforming. Knowledge telling was essentially younger writers, novice writers, who would essentially just retrieve content from long-term memory and not in direction of goals and not without organizing, and then translate that directly into text. And they contrast that with knowledge transforming, where content was retrieved in response to goals, evaluated in response to goals, and might be revised and so forth. So that this does a lot of work there. Okay. So for these models, the reason that writing helps you develop your thought and develop your understanding is because it requires you to adapt to external constraints. So if you just knowledge tell, it has very little effect. We're just putting it into text. And the idea is it depends upon you explicitly applying goals to your writing and so forth. Also related to that, in particular, if you try and write out the full text at the same time as thinking of stuff, you get a cognitive overload. And so it recommends that you focus on the thinking and less on translating into text in order to manage that more efficiently and easier. And essentially one feature of this is that translation is treated as an essentially passive process, whereby you take content and you're just translating it into, as the term implies, translating it into words. Later models, they did start talking about in text production. But we'll talk about that later. Okay. And one of the things, a series of research by Kellogg, so all this is the kind of classic old research on this, showed that, and not surprisingly, given this theory, that if you outlined in advance of writing, so you could focus on the thinking, goals, etc., then you're more effective text would be produced. People who made an outline before they wrote produced better text than people who didn't, and revising afterwards didn't make much difference for, again, in undergraduate writers. So that's kind of the standard thing, which I'm going to straw man, if you like, that I'm going to argue against. There are two main problems with this. First of all, very little is said about how knowledge is represented in this model. It's a box, and stuff's retrieved from there, but very little about that. Ian Forster, for example, said, well, how do I know what I think until I see what I say? So raising this issue, how do we get access to our knowledge and the implicit nature of knowledge? And a lot of times when you're writing, you have to find out what you think in the course of writing. Secondly, as I've already emphasized, translation, text production is a very passive thing. It doesn't do very much. By contrast, Auden, as another example, you can get lots of these quotes, said that language plays a vital role. Writing is really about the language, trying to work out what to say. So language is the mother, not the handmaiden of thought. Words will tell you things you never thought or felt before. So in the dual process model, I'm going to talk about how I apply in response to this. Okay, so these are two contrasting theories of how knowledge is represented. The one on the left is the symbolic model, and that's the one that Hayes and Flower, Bright and Scott and Maley tend to associate with that. In this, internal representation, mental representation, are essentially a bit like words stamped inside the head. So this is a network of concepts. This is a network about birds. So robin is red. Birds fly, have wings. So it's hierarchically organized. But the crucial thing about that is each node represents something out in the world. It's transparent. So you have explicitly represented ideas, and they're retrieved from memory. That's the way in which content is generated. On the right is a connectionist model, and this was Rogers and McClelland's model of the same network, but shown in connectionist form. So as input, it has the various kind of things that like pines, oak, rose, etc. Goes into a representation, how they're related. So here it says canary, goes through the network, can, and as the output, grow, move, etc. And the crucial thing about this is that all the work is done by the connections, hence connectionist, between units. They pass activation on to the next one, activate this more highly, which passes it on. And depending on the strength of these connections, when you get a pattern here and here, those two inputs, it will lead out to the final thing. So you don't have access to that. It's all implicitly controlled and organized, and you can't consult that. The other thing is, which I'll reemphasize, these connections, the weights, links between them are fixed. So at any given state of time, you have a set of fixed representations which captures all your knowledge. So your knowledge is overlaid on that, and you have to find connections which can produce canary can move, as well as saying daisy is has petals or something. So those outputs, the same connections, the same weights between them could produce those. And you have to sort of solve a simultaneous equation so that the connections between here can represent all the content in the same set of things. And it does that. It's not magic. It works perfectly doing that. Okay, so in this case, in a connectionist model, then what's the content is synthesized in relation to implicit constraints that are guiding the output. Okay, so that's in contrast to a symbolic one where you've got explicitly represent ideas which are retrieved. In this case, the ideas are constituted as they're synthesized. Second, associated with that, again, mostly under McClelland's influence, emphasized that actually if you just had that kind of network where nothing's explicitly represented, you wouldn't know what you'd learn. You'd behave very well and flexibly to the different contexts, but you wouldn't have any access to what things are. You lose track of individual ideas in that. So Kumar and Hassabis and McClelland proposed you needed complementary learning systems. On the one hand, you need connections around here, which are within the neocortical areas, which support gradual learning of content and the build-up of precisely that kind of network that I've shown you just now. But you also need something which represents individual and preserves individual experiences you have in memory. And that's the role of the hippocampus. So rapid learning of these connections within there supports initial learning of something that you experience is learned. And you have those two contrasting forms of representation. One, that underlying semantic memory, knowledge of all the things built up, which guides what you do, but you can't explicitly access, and then be sparsely represented here, individual ideas. Okay? And you have connections between the two, which enable you to interact between them. So the main idea is we've got these two different forms of representation, which we can access and which can guide us during writing. That's the main thing. Okay, so that's kind of background. The dual process model takes those two features which are associated with comprehending content and turns it to looking at how we produce content. So within this, it sees, one will talk about the knowledge retrieval system first, which is associated with the hippocampus. And that's associated with the explicit representation of knowledge as separate ideas, as we've just described. And if you just retrieve ideas from long-term memory, from these retrieve, then you get what's called knowledge telling, as we've said that. If you organize ideas and based on the goals that you want to do and retrieve different kinds of things, then you'll get knowledge transforming. So that account of the process is saying that the classic cognitive model, which explanation of how it is that writing helps us to think of things and develop ideas, can be accounted for by that, essentially by operations on the hippocampus and in episodic memory. And it's based on the idea of retrieving stuff you already know and reorganizing. The novelty which we introduced is the knowledge constituting system, which is associated with neocortical representations. That involves implicit representation of knowledge in the connections between the units, as I've just kind of shown you, and those connections pass activation through them. Synthesizing content is controlled by the strength of the connections between units, and the organization of ideas emerges as a consequence of what you're doing. It's not something that's imposed or deliberately tried to applied to. So I'm going to now repeat that again, more or less. So if we look at this in more detail, this represents your input. Here's the kind of network representing all your knowledge. And knowledge constituting, as says initially, this constraint satisfaction within this passing activation round settles into a stable state and produces initial output. That is a partial approximation. It's the best approximation you could get to this content in a single proposition or sentence. Once you produce that, you get automatic feedback to the network, and this network says, okay, subtracts that out and produces something in response to it, and so on, so forth, like this. So this is a spontaneous process. You don't have to do anything to it. You produce one thing which prompts further reaction and so on. And content is discursively constituted in the course of producing output. A couple of things to notice about that. It is a goal-directed process. Although it's spontaneous, you do have to have goals as to what you're going to do and produce each thing at each stage. And in practice, you'll see in an experiment I'll talk about in a minute, it's the way you start off writing is not with an outline, but with a summing up of my overall thing I want to talk about is this, and that changes as you go along. It involves producing full text, connected series of explicit propositions, not notes where you jot down a single word as you're planning, but a proposition trying to say something that has a truth function. And it's dispositionally organized, by which I mean these lines there. Those are fixed. They're unique to an individual that's different to others. And that's the disposition which is guiding what you're producing, but which is not explicitly available to you. And then in the full writing, ideas, actual ideas, are produced, you extract from what you've produced, and they're reorganized during revision. So you produce content to constitute your thought, and then you identify within that different ideas, how they're related and organized, etc. Ask questions if you want to. So what am I?
I'm just interested in how, if you know, how AI, the kind of models that AI use when they're writing, and whether they're related to these.
The way they've, the stuff I showed McClelland and so on, they had a big influence on deep learning and large language models based on very similar processes in terms of how they learn things. And I was going to just say, they don't produce text in the same way. They tend to produce text, and actually that's not clear. They produce text by Markov chaining. And they essentially, if you've seen them, they do it all at one go. They just go, there's your text, which I was just thinking, what did it print out? No. So some of their ideas are, McClelland particularly had a very big influence. Hassibis, so I put on that, he won the Nobel Prize about 2 years ago. I think McClelland should have done. Probably shouldn't say it, because his really massive influence on lots of, and they really influenced it. So they're very related to that, and I'll come back. Okay, so I'm going to talk about an experiment we did a few years, quite a long time ago now. Blimey. Okay, I've only taken 10 minutes. I can sit back and relax what I feel. Okay, so this is based on an experiment with undergraduates, about 80, and they had to write an article for a university newspaper. They had half an hour to do that. And we asked them to plan in two different ways. One was to make a conventional plan, an outline, and the other was to do what we say, just to sum up what's the idea I want. They could do that as often as they liked in the 5 minutes, but the idea was to just sum up what you think your overall point is. Okay. Before they wrote, they rated how much they felt they knew about the topic, and then after they wrote it, they did that again, said how much they knew. In more recent research, we actually have a scale to do that, but which correlates quite well with single rating. Okay, so it's basic setup. We identified writing processes from keystroke measures, and two measures which measured how linearly the global text was produced and how spontaneously sentences were produced. And we'll see that in the... So I'm just going to briefly do this as kind of an introduction for the final bit. So here it shows the change in what they felt they knew after they'd finished writing. So in this case, they said the same thing. I know the same as I know before. Up to 0.7 would indicate about 3/4 of the writers were saying their knowledge had increased after they'd written. Along here is how sentences were produced, and this is relatively spontaneously and relatively controlled. That's taken from a keystroke thing, and there's the mean equivalents, the two ends of that scale. So spontaneous means relatively brief pauses between sentences, quite fast output, etc. And actually also quite a lot of revision. Uncontrolled was pause, write, quite clean text, pause, etc. So that's that contrast. And then we have the two lines, this is when they planned by a single sentence before they wrote, and this is when they made an outline. Okay. So what if these development of understanding was first, not shown on the graph, the more people revised the global structure of the text, the more they'd report developments that they increased their knowledge. Okay. That kind of makes sense. They're not just writing it straight out, they're changing and going back. It's, I suppose, interesting that that's positively related to development of understanding. It might be that someone had actually getting confused or something, but that generally didn't apply for them. But the particularly interesting thing was that synthetically planned, spontaneous sentence production was associated with increased understanding. So here, if you look at the outline, that's hovering around 0. So if you make an outline before you wrote and you control the text so very deliberately, then marginally a little increase in understanding. Here, a little decrease on average when you wrote spontaneously, you made an outline, but just straight out. But those were hovering around the line. I don't think there's significant difference, that slope. Okay? But just so you see the direction. The interesting thing was that within the synthetic planning condition, these are the people who just sum up what they think before. When they wrote spontaneously, then you've got fairly reliable increases in understanding. And that fits the dual process model characterization of that process. So it suggests that it is goal-directed. You have to say, okay, I'm going to try and write about this, but you are writing out the sentence just as they occur spontaneously to you as you go through. Okay, and the other important thing was that actually in earlier study that we asked people to list their ideas before they wrote and after they wrote, and looked at how many new ideas they had after they wrote. And the more new ideas they had was correlated with knowledge increase. So this subjective measure of how much I think my knowledge has increased, as I said, is associated with how many new ideas you have after writing and with this relatively spontaneous way of articulating what you're saying. Combined with a separate process, these are independent, with revising the global structure. So some people can just spew out the sentences and not change the global structure much, but maximum change was then you both of those. An important feature of this, which I haven't got a slide about, is that quality, if you rated the test quality to judges, it did relate to how much you revised the global structure, okay, but it was diametrically opposed. This is bad for test quality, okay? So when people say make an outline, they're right if you're trying to produce clean text, because this process disrupts the quality of the text. Partly because you're just following your disposition, how it follows your ideas, which is helping you to clarify things, but which is not producing a text which is readily understandable by someone else. The global structure revision seems to be designed to, which is partly why it's related to development to understand, to create a more coherent structure, which is why it's positively related. Okay. Okay, so we're kind of stepping back, that's kind of background. One important factor in writing is how people define the writing task. And White and Bruning created these two dimensions of what they call writing beliefs. And they identified these from a series of statements about rating and how much people agreed with those. And they distinguished two beliefs. Transactional beliefs, which is essentially a belief that writing involves developing your ideas in interaction with the text, in transaction with the text. Transaction is a bit confusing as a term. So here are items that correspond to writing helps me understand better what I'm thinking about. And so someone agrees with that, would have high transactional beliefs. My thoughts and ideas become clearer to me as I write and rewrite. People who scored highly on that scale tended to get better text quality in ratings. Also, and this was uncorrelated to the other things, which is the White and Bruning, you can tell, thought these would be opposite to each other. They actually are just orthogonal. Transmissional beliefs, by contrast, they are that writing's main purpose is to give other people information. The key to successful writing is reporting actually what authorities think. So it's not me, I'm kind of trying to reporting what other people think and transmitting that as accurate as possible. If you score highly on that, people tend to get worse text quality. So high transactional, low transactional beliefs produce the best quality text. Okay, in an experimental study, we looked at, using their original scale, we confirmed the relationships with text quality, so we found it was related to that. We also found that people with high transactional beliefs, that they also rated their understanding as increasing, and that would fit with the idea that people with transactional beliefs think of writing as a way of developing their thought, okay, and that was confirmed by that. But we also said, well, if this is supposed to be about writing, it doesn't mention anything about planning at all. And so we thought they should include that in future ones. Sanders rewrote, and at just the same time, and I can't remember whether they published in the same place as us. Don't think they did. They showed that transactional beliefs, actually they suggested could be separated into two components: transactional, which is about developing your understanding, and revision, which is statements about revising and rewriting, and we'll incorporate that. And they added a further factor about the audience being important in writing. Okay, so that's just some background. So the study I'm going to talk about is to try to develop a revised scale, trying to capture those new items. So we had 43 statements about writing, 10 of them which were designed to be about transactional beliefs, transmissional, planning, which was novel, revision, and audience beliefs. Okay. And we also included some questions in this online questionnaire, which where people fill these statements about their background, typical things, gender, etc. And how well they typically did on their coursework and on exams. Okay, so it's their personal self-reports of what their average grades were across the course of a semester. We had 460 students access this, about half from Groningen and half at Southampton. And then after we screened to remove them down to just the undergraduates, people who hadn't committed, we had a sample of 370. So they're just mother tongue speakers, not anyone. So quite often you might have someone who actually was very proficient with language, but we removed them if they didn't say this was their first language, essentially. And we only had undergraduates. So that's the sample. Now I'm going to drink a bit of milk. And I'm hoping I don't get a white moustache. Have I got? Because I could only find milk. And I haven't got. Okay, so So the analysis we looked at, we took the bivariate relationships and we just inspected those and we removed any items which didn't correlate more than 0.3 with anything else. So anything was just kind of isolated thing, we just removed them. That reduced the number of these 43 down to 28. Then we did an exploratory factor analysis using M+, and maximum likelihood estimation with robust standard errors, MLR, and geomean, so an oblique rotation. Okay. Parallel analysis, I haven't got that graph, it's such a nice graph. But anyway, it indicated 5 factors, and you can see in that straight line goes across. So that looked like we were getting out the 5 factors we put in, and we progressively refined the initial solution to improve the fit. So we had those 28 items initially, but some of these didn't fit very well, and we tried to make the fit as good as possible. And that was using M+ modification indices. So that's how we developed the scale. That produced a first-order model, which indicated we have 5 factors with excellent fit. I'll show you the fit indices in a minute. But they were correlated. It was an oblique rotation. And I'm going to just do this quite quickly. So T, A, R, and the audience, this little corner here, there's quite strong, it's highly significant correlation, so moderate in strength, I suppose, was one pattern of relationships. And secondly, this is a much smaller correlation, but that was separate from these ones with transmissional and planning. And so there's equivalent to what we call TARA, transactional beliefs, revision, and audience, this corner. TMP, which is a relatively weak factor, which is transmissional beliefs and outline planning. So we've taken those 2 original beliefs, transactional and transmissional, and augmented them with information about revision and audience and outline. Okay? So those are kind of 2 dimensions that we got out of those. We're getting a first order factor, the 5 basic writing components, which can be combined into a second order factor corresponding to what transmissional and transactional beliefs. And these are the fit indices, which they're excellent. So chi-squared is non-significant, CFI and TLI at 0.99, really strong fit for those. I mean, partly we refined it until we had a strong fit. Okay, it was strong fit initially. Okay. So, okay, I can read them out. So these are the 5 first order factors. Transmissional beliefs, which is primarily that one of those primarily transmitting information is what writing is about. It's about giving other people information, sharing the info and sources accurately. So those all related to a transmissional factor. Planning, I make a detailed outline. I think you should make a detailed outline before writing. I make a well-organized plan. It involves thorough planning. Items, clearly they relate. Revision, which has most items. The key to good writing is revising, going back over it to improve, thoroughly revising an initial draft, editing many times, developing ideas over draft. So they agree with all those. Transactional, ideas become clear through writing and rewriting. It helps me better understand what I think. I can see the complexity of ideas. And the audience, I keep the overall purpose in mind. I select words for the audience and occasion keep the audience in mind. So those 5 factors correspond to different aspects of writing, relatively independent of each other, so forth, okay. The solid lines represent the significant loadings. These represent cross-loadings, which we used exploratory structure equation modeling for this, so those were allowed. Oh, and that's Jiaxin's figure. Okay, so she carried out a study using this with Chinese students, undergraduates, I think, yes. But it's exactly the same as what we found. Okay, so it's a kind of replication. It's just she's got a nicer figure than I have, so I nicked it. The second order model had those 5 factors, transmissional, planning, etc. And then they load on the TARA, transactional revision, this combination with significant loadings and transmissional models. They're quite strongly correlated, 0.7. So that suggests that these, which we were sort of interested in, they are significantly correlated, and the second order model fits those 2. So you get a higher order thing made out of the basic process of writing, corresponding to those higher level ones. Is that okay so far? Okay, I'm doing okay for time. So this is the final thing. So first of all, we were interested in this questionnaire is reliable and can be used and self-reports. We wanted to see whether that related to anything to do with their performance. So we took their self-reported coursework grades and we standardized those and regressed them on the TARA and the total second-order factors, okay? And that was calculated from the loadings of the factor labs. The reason we standardized the grades is because the Dutch have a 10-point grade system and the English have whatever ours is, 18 points, I don't know. So those are standardized. The students also estimated what percentage of their coursework involved writing essays. Okay. That model found two significant effects, accounted for a relatively small proportion, but in this context maybe okay, of how grades vary. So, I'm just going to, these are significant, and I'll show you what this means. So an interaction between transactional beliefs and the amount of coursework that involved writing essays, and an interaction between transmissional beliefs. So two significant interactions. I'll show you in the figure, so unless someone wants me to look at beta coefficient, don't think of doing this. Okay. So I thought you had more interesting lives. Okay, so look at these. This is quite a complicated graph. So on the left shows what the standardized coursework marks. Okay, and there are three graphs here laid one on top of the other. People at the bottom here have a high proportion of their coursework involves writing essays. People in the middle, it's the central, and this is relatively low number of people who write coursework essays. So let's look at this bottom plot here. Here we've got the plot at the bottom, the dimension of transactional beliefs, revision and the audience, high and low, and here what their average coursework grade is. As you can see, that slopes upwards. So the stronger your transactional beliefs are, the better grades you report getting. Okay? These are separate lines which represent the transmissional beliefs. Here, small transmissional beliefs gets higher grades, and down here it represents higher transmissional beliefs, gets lower grades. So in other words, TARA is good for quality, transmissional is bad, which is what originally White and Bruning found, and this is a more complex thing. That is for the students who most of their, I think 80 or 90% of the stuff they wrote was coursework essays. As you progressively go up here, there are people who wrote less coursework essays. They did other kinds of things, projects, but not essay kind of writing. There's slight positive slope here, but it's not significant. And then here, very little amounts of coursework. And there, the net relationship is anything negative, but it's not significant. So the key thing is this thing, which is for the people who do write lots of their coursework essays, which suggests, yes, you get positively, transactional beliefs are associated with better quality and transmissional beliefs are associated with poorer quality. So it kind of validates that. Okay. Okay. So, conclusion. Outlining does improve the quality of text, which you produce in a single draft. Okay, so if you've got to write a single draft and you need good quality, an outline is the best thing to do. But it does that precisely because it's trying to control the development of your understanding. It's stopping you doing that. That's what it's designed to do. And that's actually often when I was at school. Did you read over this, or you've gone off on that? You've got to kind of stop doing that and try and write the essay itself. Okay, so the outlining has a function, okay, but in a single draft. But it's designed particularly to stop you developing your understanding. Okay. By contrast, the development of understanding is associated with the spontaneous formulation of dispositionally organized thought. So it's not just random. It's driven by your internal implicit organization, okay, which is fixed connections between units in a connectionist model. So that's articulating what you think by following the way your thought goes that in your initial draft. And that's combined with global revision. usually in a single draft, you can't really revise it very much, okay? And it's difficult to do, which is why this is associated with poor quality. The empirical work we've done with this questionnaire and writing beliefs suggests that writing's different definitions of writing can be reliably measured and show a second-order factor consistent with transactional beliefs and transmissional beliefs, which are correlated, unlike the original Bruning beliefs. These are strongly related to coursework, not strongly, they are related to coursework, okay, significantly. In the direction of high transactional beliefs being good for you, high transmissional but low transitional beliefs being good for you. A key implication of this is that future research should focus on teaching a revision strategy where people write in this kind of way, they sum up, let their disposition guide what they write, and then go through revising that. The strategies we've used have typically involved an effective strategy, it looks like it's quite good, is once you produce your initial draft, just to go through that, trying to identify ideas. And then you might find what you thought was one idea is actually three, and you sum up each of those until you can get back to one single point. Typically people, writers, students anyway, particularly find it difficult to change what they write. So we compared conditions in which they had to remove their initial draft and write out a new draft with one where they had to correct it. If they rewrite, they write a new draft. So if they go through the stage, produce this spontaneous draft, sum it up into a single point, and then write a new draft, you get the same level of quality as you do if you make an outline before. But in addition, you're developing your understanding. So we want to put that into operation and test that fully with writers, etc. Okay, that's it. I'd be interested to hear what you all write.